Redeemer exists to help connect Jesus to people, people to community, and community to mission. I'm Daniel, and we're back for our third in a collection of talks on renewal. Today, we're looking at personal renewal. But let me start with a story. Imagine that there was a king over a kingdom, and he was cruel. The kingdom was a cruel and oppressive kingdom, and there were slaves that were mastered and dominated in really cruel ways. These slaves, even if they wanted to get out of slavery, no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't get out. And in fact, the harder they tried, their situation just got worse. But one day, a new king came in. And with his army, he came in and he conquered the old king, and he set up a new rule and a new reign. And he made a declaration that all those who were once slaves are now free. They're no longer under their old masters. They're free to move and go as they'd like. They are no longer slaves. And the slaves, those who were once slaves, they enjoyed the freedom of their new life. And yet, there were times, because of the long life that they had lived under slavery, they had formed habits, they had formed dispositions. And as they were walking around enjoying their new free life, they would revert back sometimes. They'd walk through the town square and they'd see the old master, and they'd cower and begin to get afraid. They'd even walk in submission behind him. There were times, just subconsciously, because of the rhythms and attitudes and dispositions that they had from their old days, they just found their arms locking into the stocks. They found themselves walking into that old jail cell. And the story sets up what Ephesians 4 clearly explains to us. And this message, unashamedly, is for the Christian. We're happy, whoever's here, we're happy for you to tune in, and we expect that you're going to hear some good news today. But this message is explicitly for the Christian. Christian, we heard last week in Ephesians chapter 2 that there was a once and for all time where God entered into our situations and he made us spiritually alive. We were spiritually dead, and now, because of Jesus, we're spiritually alive. And even though we're secure and free, if you're like me, you're like these former slaves where you know you're free, you've got that emancipation declaration over your life, but you still can't help but feel you're not living in total freedom. You're not living in total victory that emancipation declaration says that you should be living in. We don't always live fully spiritually alive. We don't always live fully spiritually free. And if that's you, if you're a failing and sometimes frustrated follower of Jesus, this message is for you today, as it is for me. What we need is to become, in actuality, who we are already because of the proclamation over our lives by a good and gracious God. And in the text today, we're going to find 3 encouragements for frustrated and sometimes failing followers of Jesus desiring to be personally renewed. Ephesians 4, 17 through 21. Paul writes and says, You must no longer live as the Gentiles who were in their thinking. They were futile, darkened in their understanding, lost all sensitivity, even ignorant in their hearts. That's not the way that you learned when you heard about Jesus Christ. Here's the first encouragement for the frustrated and failing follower. Christian, you are no longer sin's slave. You may feel like it. There may be that besetting sin that you don't feel like you can get away from. You are, in actuality, no longer sin's slave. We can look back and we can see that old way of thinking. The text says we were futile in our thinking. That means empty. We listen to the empty sayings of the culture around us. We followed empty superstitions. That was the way we lived, but no longer. It says we were darkened in our understanding. That's blind. We couldn't see the truth and the reality of God's revelation to us. It says we were ignorant without the truth. That's who we were. But because God entered in, as Thomas said last week, but God, who's merciful, and because of his love, he entered in, he made us alive. Those things are no longer true. Verse 21 in our text says today that we heard Christ. The connection is that we actually met Christ at one point, just like Paul did when he was Saul on the way to Damascus. Christ met him and he was changed forever, just like the Ephesian church. They met Christ once and for all, and they were changed forever. The same is true for you, Christian. There was a time when you met Christ, you heard Christ, and your heart was made alive and everything changed. And with this decisive work, but God, he entered in and he made you spiritually alive, and our spiritual slavery ended. You are no longer sin's slave. Romans 6 tells us that sin was once our master. We were slaves to sin, to an ever-increasing wickedness. Think of the slaves in our story. Chained, unable to get free, no matter how much they tried. Their masters even more and more domineering as time went on. And yet, in an instant, a new king came in, and with a declaration of victory, he said, you're free. You're no longer slaves. That has happened to you, Christian. You are no longer under sin's grip and power. You may be tempted to think, I'm never going to have freedom from this sin. I've tried to kick it. All the willpower I've got, I've tried to kick it, and I'm never going to get free with it. John 8:36 says, if the Son sets you free, Christian, if the Son sets you free, you are free indeed. Nothing can change it. It's the idea of justification, a declaration made over you. Even though you're a sinner, even though you were a slave to sin, because of the righteousness of another, the righteousness of Jesus imputed to you by faith, you can be justified, declared innocent before God. And because you're justified, you're now in this journey of sanctification. It's the idea that righteous status that has been imputed to you because of Jesus, you're actually living into it, making it a reality as the Spirit works out in you all the way into glorification one day. Justification should shape our sanctification. If you're in Christ, you are a slave to sin no longer. No condemnation, no punishment. You are no longer slaves to sin. But if you're like me, this then that nature of justification doesn't look like it in actuality. Dead and now alive. Old self and now new self. It actually doesn't seem like it's working itself out in actuality. We don't move from spiritual death into spiritual life and all of a sudden have complete victory. We don't feel the complete victory over our sin struggles. So the question is, what's going on? I know I was a slave to sin. I know that sin is no longer my master, but I don't feel like it, and I don't experience it every day, and maybe you do too. You're like me, at times a frustrated follower. How about Ephesians 4:22 through 24? You were taught with regard to your former way of life, put off the old self, to be made new with the renewing of your mind, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness. The second idea, the second encouragement for frustrated and sometimes failing followers is, Christian, Christ's blood that bought your freedom is now the blood that keeps you free. It was the freedom of justification through Christ's blood, and it's his blood that's now the declaration by which you and I live. It's the slaves from our stories. Years of patterns, years of dispositions, years of ways of thinking that are just built in, and it's trying to peek through. Even though they're no longer slaves, that old way, that old self tries to peek through, even though it's dead and even though it's gone. You too and I have patterns from our slavery to sin, and it tries to rear its ugly head. It's just a way, an old operating system that tries to work its way through almost subconsciously. We find ourselves putting our hands back in those old slavery shackles. The original Greek is written in this way, where Paul's actually saying, since the old self has been put off, and since the new self has been put on because of Jesus' work of justification, because Christ has saved you, your old self is gone. The new self is here. And then verse 25 starts with, therefore, each of you must live in such a way. Paul actually roots the imperatives of the text, the things you must do and must not do, and the indicatives of what's already true about you because of your relationship with Jesus. You're not your own. You're not your old self. You're not mastered by sin. You're not driven by those old selfish desires. And you're not in spiritual death. You are, in fact, spiritually alive. You are, in fact, justified. And therein, Paul says, is the power to live an honoring life towards God and a healthy Christian life that's good for your own soul. Milton Vincent, God did not give us his gospel just so we would embrace it and be converted. Actually, he offers it to us every day as a gift that keeps on giving everything we need for that life and godliness. Our justification must shape and root our sanctification, this growing to be more like Jesus, remembering the freed slaves when the old habits creep in and they try to push us back into that jail cell or to cower behind the old master. All we've got to do is show that emancipation document. I am free. I am no longer mastered by sin. That's true for you, Christian. Years lived in the old man, futile thinking, ignorant in our thoughts. Those habits have a way of peeking through. But if we've trusted Jesus at conversion, that's also the power by which we live in sanctification. Justification as the reassuring declaration of God's gracious act of reinstatement accompanies us throughout the Christian pilgrimage. Christ died to set us free from sin's slavery, and Christ died to keep us free from sin's slavery. There's no more mastery over us. The third encouragement then, Christian, become who you already are. Verse 25, therefore, put off all these bad things and put on all these good and beautiful virtues. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other as Christ forgave you. Follow God's example. As dearly loved children, walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us. Put off the old, put on the new. These are beautiful and good things. Interesting, we're talking about the Christian life, and I actually struggle to think of any worldview that would not affirm these good and beautiful things. Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, even atheism, Islam. They would all agree that these things are good and right ways to live. Don't lie, speak truth. Don't talk in a way that demeans other people. Speak in a way that uplifts other people. These are all good things. So what's the big deal then that this is in the Christian scriptures written by Paul? The big deal and the difference for the Christian is that God never intended for moral behavior and performance to be done just for the sake of good and right living. He doesn't say put off the old and put on the new so that you can have a better relationship with God. He doesn't say don't steal and instead work with your hands because you earn moral points. What he says is put off falsehood and put on wholesome talk because of who you already are in God. It's the law of organic life. You see, an oak kernel doesn't go into the ground and produce a squirrel. A panda doesn't come out of the womb and grow up to be a kangaroo. What you are at your core, organic life, you grow up to become. The Christian, the one who's a baby Christian, grows up to become a growing Christian, even into maturity. The law of organic life. We have to remind ourselves of our identity that's already true in Jesus. You're adopted. Live like an adopted son and daughter. You're not your own. You were bought with a price. Live as one who belongs to Jesus, our justification shaping our sanctification. The difference between Christianity and every other way of living is that Christians already have an identity and they just grow up to live in it. We become who we already are. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other as Christ God forgave you. Follow God's example and walk in a way of love as Christ loved you. We're forgiven people. And so we put on love and we live as forgiven people. We're loved people, dearly loved people. And so we live as loved people. Being a Christian is simply a lifetime of being consumed with more and more spiritual understanding of who we are now that Jesus has said, "You're mine."